How did Ambedkar reimagine Buddhism? That's something that fascinates me. My name is Devdutt Pattanaik, and I write on mythology. And when you study mythology, you also want to study the history of mythology, how stories change over time, how symbols change over time, how ideas change over time. And I found it fascinating how Sri Ambedkar, Baba Sahib Ambedkar, who wrote the Constitution of India, reimagined Buddhism. And for me, this was a political masterstroke. The more I read about it, the more impressed I am. And I thought I should make a video about it. Now, I come from a upper class Savarna background, which means in today's political circles, people like me are not allowed to comment on Ambedkar or Buddha. But, you know, it's a video, so watch it. So as a child, one is not exposed much to caste, especially when you live in an elite neighborhood in Mumbai. But you notice things like vessels are kept separately for staff, people are not allowed to use toilets, not allowed to sit in certain places, and you wonder why that is. And you're just told that's the way it is. Only later you realize this has to do with caste issues. And I had heard of Ambedkar a little bit because of, the annual functions which would be there. There would be these processions, but I didn't know much about him until I read Amar Chitra Katha. And in Amar Chitra Katha, I read a story which really deeply affected me. It tells about how Ambedkar was in London, he was in a library, and because he was poor, he couldn't afford food. So he would study in the library for a long, long time, but not eat food because he had no money. He had no money to eat food. And one of the professors who used to come to the library noticed this and realized what the situation was and went out of his way and ensured that he always got food. That he got food to eat so that he could pursue his studies. And it suddenly struck me the power of Saraswati and Lakshmi. What transforms Bhimrao Ambedkar is his knowledge. Saraswati enabled him to come out of it. And getting access to Saraswati is not easy. It is controlled by people who have access to Lakshmi. So he needed someone to help him go to the best colleges. He needed someone to help him, provide him food and nourishment so that he could study well. And you suddenly realize how important wealth is. But wealth alone is not just what makes an Ambedkar. Yes, they gave him access, but ultimately it is he who sat in the library. It is he who read the books. It is he who thought about it, did critical thinking, and came back to India and forced Indians to confront our reality with caste. But most importantly, is his relationship with Buddhism. And I found that most interesting. See, Gandhi had understood the power of religion in India. He had transformed Ahimsa from a spiritual tool into a tool for social justice. And therefore, Ahimsa, which basically, its real sense of the word Ahimsa is fasting to death. That is what the Ajivikas and the Jains used to do in the ancient times. It is not about eating vegetarian food, which is the very lazy understanding of Ahimsa that is popular today. But Ahimsa basically meant non-consumption and basically fasting to death. The oldest monuments in India are for the Ajivikas in Barabar caves in Bihar, where monks would go and fast unto death. People, they had possessed nothing. They had no family. They had no jivika. They had no livelihood. They would give up family. They would give up clothes. They would stop eating and they would try to fast to death. And that is the origin of Ahimsa. But Gandhi had turned it around and said, the British have weapons, they have power, we cannot defeat them through force, and therefore we'll use a moral high ground. And we will use the moral high ground and we will follow non-violence. So he's politicized and weaponized non-violence. And that's what he did. And I think Ambedkar would have noticed it and realized the power of religion. And what about the people he was representing, the disenfranchised Dalit lobby? The word Dalit is used by people. Somebody uses the word Bahujan, somebody uses the word Harijan. All kinds of words are being used, but what it means is a group of people in our country who were treated as untouchables, whose shadows were said to be impure, and they were kept outside the village. And it's a small proportion, 10 to 15% of India. Small but significant in Indian terms. And, the ancient words for these were words like Chandala, and people who lived in the crematorium, who dealt with dead bodies. And that this great divide, if Brahmins were the pure end of the Hindu spectrum, the Chandals were the impure end. And in between was the other castes who had a lot of fluidity, who could move up and down the hierarchy. But the Chandalas there was this glass ceiling which they could never cross. And that's an important point to remember. And of course, caste is a topic by itself, but Ambedkar represented this lobby. He ensured that everybody paid attention to this lobby, that we did not ignore them as they had been ignored for thousands of years. And that's remarkable. And for that, he needed Buddhism. Now, Buddhism had been discovered in the 19th century by the British. In India, it had been forgotten. Nobody remembered Buddhism at all. Buddhism was in China, was in Southeast Asia, but Buddhism was not remembered at all. And it was rediscovered. But what Ambedkar did is he created a new kind of Buddhism. It is called Navayana Buddhism. So it's scripturally not exactly what's there in the Vinaya Pitaka or what you read in Buddhist scriptures or the Pali scriptures or even the Mahayana Sanskrit scriptures. It is not what Nagarjuna wrote. It is not what Buddha Ghosha wrote. It is a very, very different Buddhism because it is a political form of Buddhism called Navayana, the new boat, the new way of thinking. And here it is a political statement. It is about social justice. It's about equality. It has not to do with nirvana. The purpose is not nirvana. The purpose is to get dignity and respect in society. So the purpose is very different. Remember, Buddha comes from an affluent Savarna background. Although people challenge this today, but he came from an affluent background. For the very least, he was a prince from Kapilavastu on the border of India and Nepal. And the Nepalese say he was Nepalese, Hindus say he's Indian, and all kinds of everything becomes a territory. But the point to remember is that he came from a very privileged background. He was educated, he was rich. So this is a very interesting point to remember. And he realized that life is full of suffering because we want things, we desire things. And therefore, the only way to break free from suffering is to give up desires, walk away from desires. And he promoted the monastic order. And in the end, he said, when all desires are over, there's no identity, it is nirvana. So this is the broad idea of Buddhism in its very basic form. But when Ambedkar is talking about Buddhism, he's not really referring to this idea. He's not talking about nirvana. He's not talking about dukkha. He's not talking about rebirth at all. He, in fact, says karma is a theory which was used to keep people in place, that they couldn't challenge the society. If they were told, this is your karma, if you follow your caste duties properly, in your next life, you'll be born in a better life. In this life, nothing can be done. The decision has been taken. And he didn't agree with this idea. And he said Buddha didn't say that. He created this new form of Buddhism, which does not talk about dukkha, does not talk about nirvana, does not talk about rebirth, karma. It talks about equality. And he didn't promote monasticism. He definitely did not promote a vegetarian diet. Remember, Gandhi promoted a vegetarian diet, and in promoting a vegetarian diet, he was supporting caste system, which I am sure the Gandhians will not like to hear. But the fact is, in Sabarmati Ashram today, only vegetarian food is allowed. So, Dalits may cook, but so long as they cook vegetarian food, it is okay. And that's a new form of casteism across our country. Ambedkar knew this. He caught this. He understood the manipulative nature of the elite classes of India, how they used words, twisted words. Like nowadays, you have a whole bunch of people saying how Varna is not caste and Jati is caste, and actually caste was flexible, and all these games that are played. And I think Ambedkar was extremely intelligent, and he figured it out. And and he said, no, that's not it. And for him, Buddhism was a tool for social justice, for dignity. And he said that as long as one is part of the Hindu hierarchical system, this will not work, and therefore one has to break away from it. And therefore he presented Buddhism as an opposition to Hinduism. And this kind of discourse was necessary in a democratic system. You need this. It's unfortunately, democracy is based on opposition. By becoming Buddhist, Ambedkar made a statement. He said, I'm not a Hindu. I'm not part of your hierarchical system. And that is a very powerful statement. And now you can see how the parliament is uncomfortable with this idea and says, if you convert out of Hinduism, you are no longer going to be part of the caste system. Of course, if you convert into Christianity and if you transform into Islam, you lose your caste status. But what about Buddhism? If I convert to Buddhism, is my caste still valid? If I convert to Sikhism, is my caste still valid? I think this is where religion and politics starts to play a role, and they always have played a role. And this is something that Ambedkar understood. So when we see the mythology of Buddha and you see the politics of Buddhism, you see a very different story emerging. And I notice that when I write on Buddha, people from the Dalit lobby get very upset. The Bahujan Samaj gets very depressed because they are talking about how can you talk about Buddhism? But are we going to talk about Navayana Buddhism? Are we going to talk about Nikaya Buddhism? Are we going to talk about Mahayana Buddhism? Are we going to talk about Tantric Buddhism? There are so many Buddhisms in the world. And it is something that there is no one Buddhism. And we know that as Brahmanism became important, Buddhism was wiped out of India. And old Brahmin shrines, were really, when you start looking at some of these shrines, you start noticing that they were probably at one time Buddhist shrines. Buddhist gods and goddesses became Hindu gods and goddesses. Jain gods and goddesses became Hindu gods and goddesses. And this is an old practice in India. An old abandoned temple is taken over by the next community and they transform. So many, many places in India, you'll see Jain statues, which have become images of Vishnu or Shiva. And of course, the Buddhist lobby will say it's actually a Buddha statue, but it's actually a Jain statue. And the difference, how do you know the difference? Is because the body is always covered with a cloth. It's never naked. And the Jain statues are not covered with cloth. And in Jain statues, there is a bilateral symmetry in the images. The hands are always placed like this, bilateral symmetry. The legs are crossed in a particular way. Buddhist images do not have this bilateral symmetry. The hand is either raised or touching the ground. And therefore, when people tell me that, this is a Buddhist statue, I said, no, that's a Jain statue actually. And the fact is, whether it's Buddhist or Jain, it has been taken over by a later, maybe a Lingayat group sometimes, maybe a Shiva worshipper, Vishnu worshippers. But that is not the Buddhism that Ambedkar was interested in. Ambedkar was interested in social justice and equality. He rejected rebirth. Now remember, the Jataka tales. The Jataka tales are about the Buddha in his previous lives, which means Buddhism is firmly entrenched in the theory of rebirth. And in the Jataka tales, Buddha takes 550 lives. He takes the form of plants and animals and humans as kings and merchants before he's born as Gautama Buddha. There is a Dipankara Buddha before Gautama Buddha. There are multiple Buddhas out there. But what is interesting is in the Jataka tales, Buddha never takes a female form. Buddhism looks at the female body as inferior. You have to have a male body in order to become the Buddha. In Jainism also, you have to get a male body before you can become a Tirthankara. The female body is rejected. The Tara images appear only in the 8th century. And the reason the female form of the Buddha becomes important is because in China, there was an empress called the Empress Wu who used and again weaponized Buddhism to defeat the Confucian and the Taoist scholars of her court in order to become the Empress of China. She's only Empress of China in 800 AD. Roughly the time when Hunsang came to India. And it is she who introduced the idea of these gigantic Buddha statues and female Buddha statues, Avalokiteshvara, Kuan Yin. So Buddhism generally doesn't like women. And Ambedkar was very clear, gender equality. He had a very strong right. He believed that women should get equal share of the family property. And women owe a lot to Ambedkar's arguments. He was right there talking about women's rights long before it became fashionable. Now, Buddha had become very popular in the early 20th century because of two things. The British had translated the Pali texts and had read about the Buddha, and the archaeological survey had discovered Buddhist sites, especially Ashokan stupas. And suddenly, India had a history which nobody talked about, the Buddhist period of India, about Ashokan pillars, about stupas. You had the caves of Western Maharashtra, the stupas of Nagarjun Konda, the artwork of Gandhara, and suddenly the Buddhist world had opened up. And the British argued that the Brahmins had deliberately hidden these stories. And many colonial historians and even modern historians argue that this was a deliberate act of erasure. Just as the Brahmins never spoke about untouchability and erased them and invisibilized them, that erased the Buddha. So there was a kind of, and Ambedkar would have been hearing these arguments and reading about these arguments. We know that he argued against the Aryan invasion theory. He did not know about the genetic research that we know today, where we know that the Z93 Y chromosome comes from the steppe region and is found across North India and in the upper caste Brahmin community of South India. And it comes only in 1500 BC via the Aryans. So there is this Aryan migration definitely took place, but Ambedkar did not agree. He said, no, there was no invasion of this sort. I do not agree with the colonial theory of invasion. He did not know the genetic data. He would have changed his mind because he was an extremely critical thinker and he valued science. But of course, when he was writing about these things, this knowledge was not there. It's a recent knowledge. But Ambedkar noticed how Buddha was being used by different lobbies. There was, of course, Buddha's Ahimsa. He did not promote violence, very different from the Bhagavad Gita, which promoted violence. And the British used the Bhagavad Gita as saying, look, the Hindus are violent and Buddhist texts are non-violent. And they use this to create tension between the two lobbies. And Gandhi said, well, I follow Ahimsa, and therefore Buddha was naturally linked towards the Gandhian doctrine. Nehru looked at Ashoka's pillars and said, that's a great role model to have. He was afraid, because remember, all the kings in India would look at Ram as the model king. But in Ramayana, there's a story of Shambhuka, the low caste man whose head was cut off because he wanted to become a hermit, a monk, a bhikkhu. And therefore, he was prevented from doing so in the Valmiki Ramayana. The story is there in the Valmiki Ramayana, although nobody talks about it. And therefore, that made him a problematic character. And therefore, how do you need a role model for India? And Nehru decided to make Ashoka the role model, the one who had fought the great Kalinga War and now regretted it, and Buddhism transformed him. So in ways, you'll see the Buddhist symbol, the lion, which is there, is supposed to be Buddha Nada, the speech of the Buddha represented through a lion's roar, which is very strange because Buddha's first lecture was given in a deer park. And who eats deer? Lion. Why would you use lion as a symbol of Buddhism is something that escapes me. But then royal kings, Ashoka decided he needed a lion because the Persian kings had lions. And even today you see how all the politicians love lions. It's a symbol of domination. It's a symbol of power. And that's what you see the Nehruvian images. And Savarkar also had opinions about Buddhism, if I'm not mistaken. He said that, we became a passive people because of Buddhism and we have to reclaim our military warrior heritage. And that is very important. And this is where Ambedkar did his masterstroke. He said, I'll convert to Buddhism en masse. And he does that. He said, I don't die Hindu. And by doing that, he took Buddhism away from people who were trying to claim it in different ways, whether it was Savarkar, whether it was Nehru, whether it was Gandhi. He said, no, I will now look at Buddhism in a very different way, make it a political tool for dignity and respect. And Navayana Buddhism was born. But it is very different from Mahayana Buddhism. It is very different from Tantric Buddhism. It is very different from Nikaya or the old Buddhism. And one must remember that. In Southeast Asia, you have Nikaya Buddhism. This looks at Gautama Buddha. And it talks about Buddha, the teacher. But if you go towards China and Japan, you have Mahayana Buddhism, where you pray to the Buddha to solve your problems. And there are bodhisattvas like Padmapani and Vajrapani. And then you have the Tantric Buddhism, which is really magical Buddhism, where you have guardian gods and you have sexual and violent imageries on Tibetan. And of course, Dalai Lama never talks about it. And that is a different topic by itself. That's a very different Buddhism. So Buddhism transforms. Buddhism goes to America and Europe and becomes what is called Berkeley Buddhism. It is all about peace and love. And it forgets the fact that Buddhism was sponsored by merchants, monks, traders. It is the original proto-capitalism. That's another Buddhism which we know about. But Ambedkar Buddhism was a unique invention of the 20th century, which brought religion and made people question so many things about Indian history, about Indian mythology, about Brahminism, about caste. It provokes you to think about so many things. And for that, we should forever be grateful to Ambedkar's ideas of Buddhism.